Jakob, thank you for that. It's really lovely to be here, and I'm very grateful for the invite. That's lovely. And I'm really grateful that you have chosen to spend kind of an hour with me with the book. That's lovely too. So thank you ever so much for your time. What I intend to do is to go through some of those kind of key themes from the book, and then read. I'm going to read. Is it lazy? I don't know if it's lazy or whether I'm just so tired at the end of term, at the end of marking, that I kind of figure what I wrote a few months ago says it better than me sitting here, you know, kind of winging it. So there are a few sections I'm gonna read in order to kind of make some specific points. I'm going to say a little bit more about the fourth chapter, which is on pathological hopelessness, or the idea that the institution, the university, operates in ways that are diseased and toxic and that make us ill and that are governed by modes of ill-being. So I'll probably might read one or two sections from, or paragraphs from that section, but I do want to go through the key themes. I guess it's also important to note that I'm probably not going to raise too many kind of concrete examples from particular institutions or particular things that are going on. And certainly within English higher education, there's a lot going on at the moment. Strikes at Liverpool, there's a boycott and strikes at the University of Leicester, just up the road from me, over redundancies. At Liverpool over the use of metrics in order to kind of enact restructuring and stuff. And we all have these examples, and we can talk about them later. The book, when I was in conversation with Christian a while back, the book really is kind of philosophical, because that's kind of where my head is at. So I'm kind of thinking conceptually about what it is that I'm seeing and reading and hearing in the university as a professor of education and technology at De Montfort in Leicester, but also as a trade union caseworker and a trade union negotiator. So some of it comes out of that as well, and also some historical engagement with, I guess, more kind of autonomous networks of educators who are looking at things like the development of a cooperative university, or the ways in which academics might be able to work in society with a range of other people as intellectuals, and effectively working to kind of abolish their prestige and privilege, their identities as kind of fetishized and as, I guess, meaningless, really, in dealing with a range of intersecting crises. So I guess that was my starting point for writing the book. It follows on from, I only have snazzy titles for books. So the previous book was called The Alienated Academic, which took academic labor and academic work, took effectively kind of the academic as the unit of analysis, looked at the ways in which systemically their labor, the outputs of their labor, their communities and their very selves, their identities became estranged and alienated. And my sense, I guess, over the course of the following kind of, I don't know, maybe 6, 9, 12 months, was that the unit of analysis might usefully become the university. In part because that range of intersecting crises, which are of political economy and austerity, you know, it's certainly in the UK, we're into, you know, it's kind of year 13 or whatever of sort of post the latest kind of financial crisis, and that's enabled a range of ways in which the university might be repurposed and restructured. Never waste a crisis, but that intersects with currently an epidemiological crisis. It intersects with crises of climate forcing, for instance, but also a whole range of other historical and material crises that have not just inflected and infected the global north. So an ongoing range of kind of colonial or crises of coloniality, which have bastardized and made marginal a whole range of kind of bodies and communities inside the global north, but in other spaces as well, upon which institutions in the north feed. So I'm quite interested, I guess, in that moment of thinking about the ways in which the form of the university, and there are a range of forms of the university in English higher education, which is where I'm based, how they get kind of repurposed, and what the content of universities become, and the ways in which the content of the university enables a repurposing of the forms of the university. And it's quite interesting because there's a whole rush of books written I mean, there's a whole legacy of books written about higher education and the idea of the university, but some of this, I guess, is about we speak of the good university, or the cooperative university, or the public university, or a divergence between public and private, and we ask whether we're gambling with universities, and we ask whether I suppose can we speak of universities, and I'm interested in the kind of political economics that wrap around that. So I'm interested in the ways in which value in its kind of Marxist sense, and certainly the ways in which living labour are used in order to enable the reproduction of an alienating system, a system of expropriation, exploitation, and extraction. How that stands up against, or the extreme cognitive dissonance that occurs when we think about that and the ways in which the university is reproduced around that, against the idea that it's a labour of love, that we're doing it because we love our students. We're doing it because, as Bell Hooks would argue, we care about the souls of our students and ourselves. And there's this massive disconnect in that space, because we're being brutalized and bastardized, because the system seeks to revolutionize itself in order to generate forms of surplus time, surplus labor, surplus outputs, and it will infect the home, and it will infect our other responsibilities, our caring responsibilities, our responsibilities as citizens, our responsibilities as wives and husbands and lovers and partners, and our responsibilities to ourselves for self-care. So there are a whole range of kind of embodied impacts in that kind of tension between value and values, and what that might mean, the way in which values are kind of co-opted by the system. So we talk of the university family. The university is a family, or the university is a particular kind of caring community that can enact modes of change. And yet I see a kind of the overriding sort of movement of spirit or reason for the university is the development of human capital. It's the development of human capital that can drive modes of value that are governed by the market, private property, the division of labour, commodity exchange, production of commodities from which other partners can drive rents, can extract rents and surpluses. And this becomes a kind of an economistic common sense for the university that is deeply dehumanizing, beyond the conception that higher education operates within a system that is closed, that there's no alternative to capitalist social relations, that we are at the end of history, that capitalism won in 89-90, reinforced itself, and that all we can do is look for Promethean solutions to problems based around risk inside the system, and look to tweak those so we get a better functioning system that eventually will deliver prosperity for all. And so I guess that sort of narrative tends to foreclose the development of alternatives, certainly within the university, certainly within the idea that there might be alternative modes of intellectual production. And this is why I guess I've focused upon that idea of the end of history, which I took from the podcast Auf Hebunga Bunga, the Global Politics podcast at the end of history, where they were talking about the ways in which events were such that we were now seeing the return of our agency, the return of our ability to make our own history, to become autonomous again. And obviously there are a range of struggles at the moment, which might be in relation to the murder of George Floyd. I don't know, England footballers taking the knee, whatever that means, but it might also be, say, the mass protests in Colombia at the moment. There's a range of kind of struggles that are going on that demonstrate in some respect the kind of return of history. So I focus upon hopelessness. There's a tendency, I guess, amongst academics or amongst people who work inside the university, and I think it's crucial. I said academics there. The book, I'm an academic, but the book is deliberately about, I suppose, the abolition of the idea of the academic. And I'm very interested in the ways in which we look for solidarity between professional services staff who work within institutions, academics all down the kind of range of hierarchies, from precarious right the way through to people like me who have more privilege and prestige, also to students who are giving their labour into the institution as well, and in the English case taking on large debts. So for me, I see them all encompassed as part of this kind of idea of intellectual labour in the university, but we all know that intellectual work is going on across society as well. It's just reified inside these spaces. So I think about hopelessness, and I focus on hopelessness in two senses, and I'll just read from the book around that. In the reproduction of the capitalist university, this struggle catalyzes hopelessness in two senses. The first lies in the inability of the university to address crises other than through the imposition of authoritarian forms of management, pathological cultures of growth or business as usual, and methodological activities that fixate on commodity exchange. It has therefore become a useless use value, in the sense that its social worth and its feasibility are defined by flows of capital, in which the creation of a livable environment for humans is secondary. Here, the form of the hopeless university has become devoid of useful content. The second sense lies in an understanding of how capital structures and disciplines university work, feeding off it as a labour of love, negating its humane possibilities, and as a result breeding despair, depression and melancholy as a space beyond anxiety. And he hopes that universities might be spaces for the creation of new forms of freedom, self-actualization, social wealth or public good are marginalized by the imposition of precarious existences inside anxiety machines that catalyze overwork and ill-being. So in kind of, one of the things I think that's quite important about this as well is not simply that focus on kind of connecting work across professional services, students and academics, but also seeing this as intercommunal, intergenerational, and intersectional. In particular, if we think, I was quite taken by the work of John Narayan and his kind of reinterpretation of Huey Newton in relation to Lenin. So, and certainly this kind of focus on intercommunal work. And clearly the pandemic has differentiated certainly within English higher education, the kind of differential impacts upon different bodies. That different bodies are facing different stresses, pressures, traumas within the pandemic, and they, I guess, kind of amplify traumas that were already in place. So for me, it's quite important to recognize the privilege I have. I'm not saying I haven't kind of struggled during the pandemic, but the kind of levels of privilege I have. For instance, I don't have to come in, I'm in the office now, I haven't had to come in. Other people have had to come in unvaccinated into a working space in order to maintain an estate and an infrastructure. And I want to demonstrate solidarity with those people in whichever way I kind of can. So for me, I guess the final thing I want to say, that's the kind of first chapter in kind of synopsis. The final thing I want to say is that this is looking, I'm trying to look less at the kind of symptomatic response or focus upon the kind of idea of hopelessness in the university, and how do we push back against this symptom or that symptom when our bodies get ruptured or our practices and relations get ruptured. And more thinking about a kind of categorical analysis that enables us to connect our labor across different kind of groups in order to attempt to build some kind of modes of solidarity that might begin in the university, but they have to flow outside. They have to join to other social ruptures. They have to join to other social structures in order to have any meaning. In the kind of second chapter, I move on to focus a little bit about an idea that Kate Bowles, a brilliant woman, academic who works in Wollongong in Australia, we wrote about this thing called we wrote about anxiety effectively in the university in 2016, in a paper in 2016. And we wrote about this idea of the university as an anxiety machine, whose motive, power and energy was predicated upon flows of anxiety over position, anxiety over contracts, anxiety over effectively, am I a good enough academic, professional member of professional services, librarian, technician, student, whatever. So a kind of a constant struggle for position that I guess echoes the work of Engels in The Condition of the Working Class in England, where he talks about competition as the war of all against all, effectively, and that universities kind of within that space catalyze modes of depression, depression and anxiety that are, I guess, revealed in overwork. They're revealed in ill health, they're revealed in ill-being, they're revealed in a lack of solidarity and kind of class composition across the range of workers in the institution. In fact, let's quote again, because I think I have a point about anxiety here in relation to, am I a good enough worker? So I write, anxiety about position forces individuals to question, am I a good academic or university citizen? Am I productive enough? For staff on casualised contracts or for whom tenure or promotion matters, there's an internalised judgment of, am I working hard enough? And an externalised projection onto others of, are you producing enough? Inside the anxiety machine, it is impossible to be productive enough and therefore good enough. And there is always the threat of a reserve army of surplus labour that disciplines those in post. Through this threat, the anxiety instilled through competition at every level militates against solidarity and cooperation. The defining status-driven impulse is to increase personal value as an entrepreneur, demonstrated through the traces left in publications, leading research bids, managing agile innovation projects, or blogging and emailing at all hours. As a result, staff and students are locked into a toxic system which reproduces reified, anxiety-infused identities. So I argue, I guess, that is it's immiserating for many people. And again, we see a range of reports of quit lit and sick lit, so literature about people quitting, literature about people being ill, and so there is a level of immiseration that is going on, and that forms a kind of an immoral economy. I was very taken by the work of E.P. Well, I'm a historian of old, right? All of my degrees are in history, so, and I'm an 18th century historian, and so I was taken with the work of E.P. Thompson, who writes about the condition of the English working class. He writes about the nature of moral economies operating within communities where judgments are made about individuals who operate beyond the norms of those communities. And I argue, I guess, that our struggle in the university is against its immoral economy. That increasingly, certainly post 2007-8, there's been an acceleration of new workload models, of new technologies that have been used to kind of proletarianize work by fragmenting it, that technology is being used to outsource, in particular, professional services staff, that there's a process of kind of what we might term subsumption in kind of Marxist terms, that we're seeing, I guess, the kind of, in particular, the real subsumption, not just the formal subsumption, but the real subsumption of higher education as it is repurposed, as time and activity are repurposed, as new kind of groupings of people are brought together in order to leverage, in order that rents can be leveraged, for instance, and that is kind of related to prestige, and that within that, then I guess part of our struggle is against that. It's against the lengthening of the working day. It's against the ways in which technology, I'm not necessarily saying we all need to become Luddites, but it's a sense of the way in which, is it possible for us to push back against the ways in which technology's ways of working, metrics for instance, in the UK, the Research Excellence Framework or the Teaching Excellence Framework, or now the Knowledge Excellence Framework, how they are used to kind of recompose institutions? Or is the game up? We can't struggle inside universities. It's game over. We're too far, that ship sail, we're too far down the rabbit hole, whatever kind of useless metaphor you want to use. But there is no space inside the university to struggle. And we are increasingly estranged. And in that, I think I kind of, that brings me to connect with the work of, for instance, John Holloway, but also more latterly, Fred Moten in the United States, when talking about the undercommons and about the experience of Black and of colour academics, to think about the scream. How do we scream against the indignation of the world as it is constructed, as it demonizes, as it makes toxic? And how do we therefore generate solidarity within that? In the third chapter, I go on to kind of talk about forms, the form of the university. And I think for me, it's quite interesting that there is a sense in which a lot of writers are focused upon the form of the university and thinking about, the good university or public versus private, cooperative universities, that kind of thing. There's been a lot of writing as well, I guess, about the ways in which those forms and the content they have then leads to embodied trauma. And I'm quite interested in thinking about the ways in which we stitch those back together, which I think is what Marx does in the economic and philosophical manuscripts, and certainly in his latter work as well, his ethnographic manuscripts, sorry. So I'm quite interested, I guess, in the way in which crisis and the crisis of value reshapes our narratives around the forms of the university, and in particular around risk and the management of risk. So I write about this in terms of the university, not just as an entity. And I know that Christian has done some work on this as well. So universities as joint ventures, universities as associations of capitals, universities as assemblages. So some universities are leveraged to get, they have bonds, so they're leveraged in the insurance markets. They will also have, they have to maintain a credit rating. They might have corporate partnerships, for instance, with Blackboard as a virtual learning environment, or as a range of content providers as well. So the university is part of a network, an assemblage, which is effectively reshaped by finance capital, by financialization, which tends to revolutionize culture and practice inside the institution, because you have to maintain your credit rating. You have to be able to kind of, I guess, maintain or manage the risk that you're gonna fail in maintaining your bond covenants, for instance. Or in English higher education, the Office for Students, which is the regulator, has regulations in relation to cash at the bank in order to effectively maintain your own liquidity. So governance and regulation imposed through corporate forms inside the institution tend to act as a kind of a terrain of control. So let's just kind of see what have I written about that. And this is from that kind of third chapter on forms of hopelessness. Governance structures attempt to manage risks in ways that are disciplinary and that reproduce a particular symbolic view of the university as a bureaucracy for ordering reality. The imposition of student protection plans, access and participation plans in the United Kingdom create a regulatory framework inside which academics have a limited narrative beyond that which is shaped on the terms of employability, excellence, impact, value for money. As a result, macroeconomic control shapes institutional risk profiles in relation to profitability and discourses of productivity, technological innovation, market liberalization, and entrepreneurial activity. There's a critical point as well that I'm just gonna follow that up with a quote. I hack a point that is made by John Holloway about institutions that are forced to operate within a system of capitalist social relations and capitalist social reproduction. So where I hack the quote from Holloway, it goes as follows. What the university does is limited and shaped by the fact that it exists as just one node in a web of social relations. Crucially, this web of social relations centers on the way in which work is organized. The fact that work is organized on a capitalist basis means that what the university does and can do is limited and shaped by the need to maintain the system of capitalist organization of which it is a part. That means in large scale, this brings me back to my issue around, can we struggle for something inside the university, or can we, but only part of a broader set of social struggles in order to move beyond? And one of the issues here is that we know that the university, not only is it brought to us through partnerships with bond markets and with finance capital, but that also then brings us into partnership with firms enacting securitization, with transnational forms of education, which are engaged with authoritarian regimes, with modes of militarization and research for the military, which we might kind of connect to kind of, I guess, Akili Mbembe's work on necropolitics as a kind of necro education almost. So we're thinking there about, well, how does money makes the kind of whole form of the university abject. I talk about financialized abjection within the context of the book, where debt, commodification, individualization makes toxic our relationships, and we're forced effectively to compete, but also disciplines, subjects are forced to compete, institutions are forced to compete. They're judged, they're sorted, they're privatized, they become unfree. And one of the ways in which, I won't go into it in too much detail here in the next kind of 15 minutes before I finish, but one of the crucial things here is the way in which this then, not only does it estrange us from each other, but it estranges us from nature and the world. And this is kind of, there is a distinct strand within my within the book, which is about the ways in which the university kind of forces us to engage with solastalgia, this idea that environmental, there's nothing we can do about environmental rupture other than grieve, because the only thing that we can do is to imagine becoming more efficiently unsustainable. And there is almost kind of we're just waiting for COVID 2025, COVID 2029, COVID 2030, or whatever it is, the next moment at which the way in which we have recomposed the world ruptures the world. And our deep kind of sense of, internally, our deep sense of kind of pain and melancholy and anxiety and depression, that there is nothing we can do about that. And that all we can do is wait for the next, I guess, the next Promethean technician to come and find a fix for the latest thing we've broken. That leads me on to the kind of four. This is upbeat, right? It's all good stuff. It brings me on to the kind of the chapter I wanted to spend a little bit more time on, which is kind of pathological hopelessness. In part, I suppose, because both the alienated academic kind of came out as I was exiting a decade of therapy. So there's a kind of very clear sense of kind of me engaging with my own kind of mental health, my own psychology, and who I am as a person, my identity, my relationship to my friends, my loved ones, the other, effectively. And so I suppose there's a sort of sense in this, the kind of the pathological, the anxious, the depressed, it kind of chimes with me, really. So there's a connection there. And I suppose what I'm seeing when I'm kind of reading the full range of, I don't know, it might be graduate students who can't find tenure, who give up, who know they're not going to get that role within higher education, have to process their anxiety, depression around the fact that the world they hoped for isn't going to arrive, and what are they going to do therefore as a result. Where I read the stories about people who have survived toxic sexualized cultures within institutions, who have shared examples of sexual violence or trauma on campus, where I hear about people who have had to, I guess, take time off or have had to quit because of mental health or embodied issues. I see this kind of sense of almost more multimorbidity. And one of the things that Sarah Amsler from the University of Nottingham reminds me quite often about is the ways in which we certainly say within COVID, and the way in which universities have amplified and accelerated overwork during the pandemic and have been negligent around certain bodies, is that we need to be careful about the ways in which those traumas will be revealed to us in now, or in 3, 6, 9, 12, 18 months time, and how we support each other through that. So I talk in the chapter about forms of toxic managerialism and the ways in which those have become diseased, and they attempt to internalize that disease within us. And that there is a kind of, there's a sense in which we kind of become disconnected, or there's a sense of internal rupture, because we can only know ourselves in kind of a one-sided way. We know ourselves in relation to the academic commodity or academic production, or student satisfaction, or our ability to implement that new agile technology project, or whatever it might be. We don't know ourselves as kind of full humans. And part of the issue there is work infects our homes. When we're working at home during the pandemic, is that it's made clear that there is kind of a power outside of ourselves that is judging us, that there is we become anxious about that, in part because we don't want to be abandoned and we don't want to be forgotten, because how are we going to put food on the table and pay down our rents, and how are we going to get up in that next kind of, I don't know, how are we going to get that next layer of prestige if we're abandoned or forgotten? And so this is quite a traumatic environment, framed by ill-being. I term it ill-being. Universities talk about well-being, right? And put on resilience courses and all of that kind of stuff. And they make it about us and our deficits, and they don't make it about structurally reproduced and reimposed kind of forms of othering inside institutions, which are felt differentially. And in the alienated academic, I think tried to think this through in terms of Weltschmerz. Forgive my terrible English pronunciation, but sort of almost a world weariness beyond anxiety, and within that is kind of catalyzed through burnout, uncertainty over work, occupational health referrals, all of that kind of stuff. But I'll just read, there's another section here that I just want to read, or another little paragraph I'd like to read around that. At the end of history, so this idea we have no agency, at the end of history, the university and its workers continue either to believe in the possibility for collective self-improvement through an enthusiastic dedication to work, or to find ways to cope, hope, dope, or consume in the face of pathological phenomena. In response, there is a need to refuse modes of hope that require optimism elevated to, and here I quote from Wolfgang Streeck, the status of a public virtue and civic responsibility, and which also labels pessimism as a socially harmful personal deficiency. Instead, the pathology of the university reinforces anxiety because its leaders demand that its workers are never skeptical. They become an active part of the institutional family. Such activity maintains a focus upon continuous personal enhancement in the face of competitive pessimism. This is so deeply entrenched that not even the reinforcing realities of financial, epidemiological, and climate crises can move the university cultures beyond their pathological insistence on the reproduction of value. I just want to follow that up with a little piece on trauma. In this system, modes of denial, repression, and disassociation represent trauma that is social and individual. The revelation of sexual harassment and abuse as peer and contra power on campuses exposes a continuum of violence in the institution. The institution maintains credibility through modes of silencing and secrecy in policy, by questioning credibility and denial, and in calls to move on, especially where perpetrators have power and where victims are devalued and marginalized already because they are caregivers, queer, female, black, disabled. This calls into question the ethics of non-disclosure agreements, gagging orders, and institutional approaches to complaints and cultures of silence, which have seen a number of women academics resign from institutions. Moreover, trauma is generalized in terms of other forms of violence against bodies, including through restructuring, the loss of tenure, ongoing precarity, punitive performance management, workplace monitoring, and workload intensification. In this, I guess I'm taken by, I admitted yesterday to having an academic crush on Fred Moten, who I've already spoken about, wrote the Undercommons with Stefano Hani in 2013. And in particular, his 2017-18 trilogy, Consent Not to Be a Single Being, has kind of informed some of this work. And he speaks about Black feminism in particular, and the kind of counterpower of Black feminism, which he talks about the anti-material ecology of Black and thoughtful stolen life as it steals away. And I think I've tended within this to try to think a little bit more about my own position as a white male professor with access to certain forms of privilege and resources and time, and what it might mean, therefore, to think about that in terms of my relationship to various others who would not see themselves necessarily as reflected in me, and therefore how do I seek to grow myself as a relational person and as a relational intellectual worker in society in relation to the experiences of those individuals and those kind of communities. That's been very important to me. And the last thing I want to say about that chapter really is that, again, from my work with Kate Bowles, we use the metaphor of university work akin to the peloton in professional cycling. Sorry about this, Christian, because I know you don't do kind of sport, but within the kind of peloton is, I don't know, the Tour de France, the Giro d'Italia, the Vuelta a España. You'll have competing teams and they will have a leader. And I guess the kind of the poster boy for those team leaders in a very negative way would be Lance Armstrong, and the idea that he doped, and that there was a culture of bullying within not only his team but also within the peloton. that has been kind of written about elsewhere, so that you would have very toxic cultures, very toxic use of technologies, very toxic use of drugs, for instance, to maintain particular modes of performance around particular high-performing individuals who we argue, Kate and I argue, are equivalent to effectively to kind of those high-performing professors with no caring responsibilities who can be always on. And part of the issue there, I guess, for us is to think about how does the culture operate in that space then? Within cycling, it operates through cultures of omerta, so cultures of silence, where you deny what you've seen, you deny what's happening to yourself, you gaslight others and you gaslight yourself. And so yourself becomes distorted in that moment. You become one-sided, you become a fragmented, partial human being. And so one of the things that I move on to kind of thinking about, and I will move on in a minute because I'm blathering on too much, is about yearning. And I deliberately, there's so many people who've done work on critical hope and have done brilliant and beautiful work on critical hope. And that work deserves reading. Work of people like Anna Dinnerstein at Bath, for instance, deserves reading. It is really powerful. Sarah Amsler's reconnection with the work of Bloch on venturing beyond, all of that, beautiful work. I struggle to engage with it because of me and who I am. I struggle to engage with it because of my life experiences. And what feels more powerful to me is to sit with hopelessness and to work through hopelessness, which takes time, to sit with that hopelessness and to grieve and to mourn the world as it is. And I'm not saying that Anna and Sarah don't do that grieving and mourning, but for me, it's really important that we grieve and mourn the world that we wished for that can never be, in order to decide what it is we yearn for. So for me, there's something here about yearning. The 5th chapter is on methodological. I don't intend going, I'm going to shut this down in a couple of minutes. I don't intend going into that in too much detail. The importance of it really for me is to argue that the university operates as if we are living within a closed system that just needs to be rationalized. If we tweak the algorithm, get the technology sorted, we can manage risk appropriately. We can deal with the range of shocks, crises, COVID, climate forcing, collapse in the nitrogen cycle, ocean acidification. We'll find a technological fix for that. We won't have to deal with social reproduction. We won't have to deal with competitive cultures of consumerism, which are live within universities. In fact, we'll just wait for the university to develop the knowledge transfer, the new app, the download from the matrix, which will solve the problem. And we will manage that through the market and through government policy, which prioritizes human capital development and marketization. There is a sense, I'm just going to read one section which comes from the Birmingham Autonomous University, a group of radical students who wrote in a book that Joss Wynn and I edited in 2017 on mass intellectuality. They wrote beautifully about the idea of the methodological university. So I'll just give you their definition. The university operates methodologically through a tempo set by its associations. It's machinic, it operates through a tempo with a harmonic motion dictated by values' gravitational pull. It is systematic in organizing and arranging singular forms of work in particular closed ways. So my concrete work in the university gets arranged in relation to particular norms of performance, impact, entrepreneurship. And here's where I quote from the Birmingham Autonomous University. The mechanical model of the methodological university acts as an active process of enclosing knowledge, where knowledge neither knows itself nor its object. The methodological university seeks to reproduce itself through a seemingly unshakable positivism. Its common sense reinforces the domain of specialist knowledge production, which promotes a formalistic, monological approach to knowledge production, mirroring factory production lines and embodying the fragmentation and separation inhering in society through the ever-intensifying division of labour. So the idea here really is that, that the university's activities are predicated upon the constant search for new forms of valuable content that can be, from which we can extract rents, for instance, and that this leads to fragmentation of you and me, fragmentation of our professional services colleagues, our students, fragmentation of our disciplines and our subjects, and fragmentation of our institutions. This is reinforced technologically. The last thing I want to say really is about the final couple of chapters. And I think it's really interesting, and it's classic for me, this is, right? So that there's quite a lot on the negative, on critiquing. It's classic academic thing, right? On the critiquing. But then when you get to that kind of those sections that sort of say, oh well, Richard, that's loving everything, so what do we do now? I kind of loathe that, and I kind of hate it. And one of the things that I'm very taken with, in particular, I guess, from my reading, my crucially naive reading of Indigenous scholars, and my crucially naive engagement with people who are looking to do intellectual work and work at the level of society, is that I'm not interested in blueprints. I'm not interested in utopias. I'm not interested in recommendations for action, because that reinforces my sense is that reinforces the world that we have constructed, which has led us to the precipice. Or if we were to think about the work of Indigenous scholars, well, they've been over the precipice. Forms of coloniality, forms of colonialism, seizures of land, denial of language, all of those things. These communities and individuals have been living with this forever. So I do have a couple of chapters, and they focus upon heart as so our work collectively as a movement of heart and soul, of working through our despair, doing that collectively together and relationally, as a process of kind of mourning and understanding that for which we yearn. And that for me, this part of this is that kind of relinking that human, the concrete existences and examples that we have of how we are being brutalized and for what we yearn inside our institutions. How do we link those stories of mourning and grief? How do we link those to the political economy of the institution in order to try and work out, well, where now? In a more meaningful way, where now? And how do we do that in a way that enables us to transcend our abstraction as labor, just as living labor? That's all we are, which is labor. And that enables us to contribute to the reproduction of the university, but also the reproduction of hopelessness in this kind of current construction. So how do we collectively have a conversation that dials down the voices of people who look like me, frankly, and dials up the voices of people who have been brutalized within this kind of world that we have created? Part of that, I think, is, for me, it was quite interesting. I speak a little bit in the book about composting, the idea of composting. How do we compost the world that we're in and recycle the nutrients that we want? Recycle the content, recycle the relationships, recycle the cultures, the languages that we want and need. How do we recycle those? And then how do we get rid of the waste? What do we do? How do we move this idea of composting and recycling forward? And what do we want to compost and what do we want to recycle? And how do we understand that in that process, our subjectivities are entangled? The system tries to separate us out and objectify us and our work and make us about the objects that we produce. How do we move beyond that in order to see the ways in which our subjectivities are entangled so that we can move beyond? So I'm just now going to end with a kind of final quote, really. Capital's movement of the forces and relations of production are its attempt to reassert stable forms of accumulation in a world that cannot bear them. The university is a crucial model in this movement of reassertion, and it acts as if it is part of a deterministic system. Therefore, it works to reject the realities of life as an open, non-linear, and exponentially chaotic movement of becoming. Our work is entangled with this moving contradiction and must prioritize Césaire's invocation that I must begin. Begin what? The only thing in the world that is worth beginning, the end of the world, no less. I think I'm probably done there, Christian. I think I'm probably done.
Okay. Thank you, Richard, for this excellent talk. I think that I will limit my short intervention to few words and a quick questions, like simply to allow all our participants in the seminar to prepare their questions and to move on with the debate, because you've put on the table, well, like such a wide variety of the topics. And I have two simple, maybe contradictory questions. The first question asks about why do you decided to keep the label, the idea, and the institutional frame of the university, like while at the same time doing so much work to dismantle it, like to show it the dismantling done by by the capital, by the association of capitals on the one side, and on the other. You are emphasizing so much the positive dismantling of the university, and as for your task, you want to abolish it, and yeah. So for why is your motivation to maintain the university as a point of reference? Like, why do you decide to do that? And the contradictory question to that one is, if you want to, or if you, and I really sympathize with this task, like with the abolition movement of the university. I think this is like one of the greatest value of the book, the Hopeless University, that you simply shown us that the despair produced by this anxiety machine is like unbearable anymore. And yeah, we need to think individually and in groups about the reasons why to leave the empty shell of the university form behind us, behind our back, because it failed us. Like in many different countries, it failed us during the pandemic, to the different degree in different countries, I would say. But in such a task, what would you say about further future role of the life science component of the university? Would it be also left behind and abolished? Like, what about there is a nice communist project by Mike Neary developed about the synthesis of social sciences and science. Is this your paradigm to think about why do we need to simply go beyond the current methodological disciplinary divisions within the university? Okay, I will leave you with these two questions, and yeah, let's warm up before the real debate with part of the participants.
I don't necessarily see them as contradictory questions, and they're good questions. I suppose I suppose the university is the kind of the mode of analysis, because I suppose part of it was I was sick of hearing people talk about the university in particular kind of conceptions. So this is deliberately, you know, almost pushing against the idea of the good university, or the public university, or the like it was ever that, or the you know, even the cooperative university that doesn't examine the kind of contradictions of the system inside which it is going to have to become cooperative or good or whatever, and that kind of continues to maintain, I guess, forms of a privileged existence for particular bodies inside those spaces. It's also a space in which I have been, I suppose I have been institutionalized inside universities now for other than a brief stint doing furniture removals and then traveling the world. I've been incarcerated inside universities for over 30 years. And so they're kind of what I know, you know. So part of it is this idea of, well, is the container of the university, is it possible for us therefore to use it as, can we do something different as a transitional demand away from the world that is, in order to migrate to something else? And I think that certainly in the UK around the time of 2010, 2011, a lot of people were thinking, no, I kind of can't. So I'm going to set up a social science centre, or I'm going to set up a free university of Brighton or Liverpool, or I'm going to set up an autonomous, or do some work in an autonomous social centre, or whatever it might be. You know, but that's exhausting, right? Because you've got to do your university work and your care of yourself and your work in the community, and now this other project. And they're kind of, and that's very difficult to do, you know. So I was very interested then in, well, these institutions are regarded as being, they're in the news quite a lot. There's all sorts of stuff around value for money. It's certainly in English higher education, are fees too high? What do we do about the university? Culture wars, you know, all these Marxists, you know, teaching engineering through a Marxist lens, or whatever it is. So I think and therefore, if we're going to think beyond that, I have to kind of start from that and then look at where, and then it's not for me to say, where are we going to go? It's for me to open up the space that says, this is what we've got, what we're going to do. Which is why I kind of maintain the frame of the university, which brings me, I think, to your second point, which is, you're dead right. Marx talks very much, and that's picked up on by a range of Mike Neary is one, but Glenn Rakowski as well speaks about this, about the ways in which that fragmentation of disciplines does not enable us to address some of the crucial issues that are live in the world. Because, you know, it's all about metrics in engineering or in social sciences, and at best it's about a little bit of an interdisciplinary team that might be able to solve this issue. It is not a true kind of refusion of disciplines. So, you know, we have Marx almost kind of talking about history as the kind of as the kind of most meaningful science, because where it is material, where it is about humans understanding their place and their material power and how they create the world. And from that we get, you know, other areas of working that might flow. But certainly I guess Mike would say that the life sciences have value through their kind, you know, well, there's that reintegration of science and social science and philosophy in particular enables us to move beyond our one-sidedness. And that doesn't mean that, no, you know, we all have to be able to differentiate equations, and we all have to be able to define the, you know, we've got an architect on the scene, on the call, you know, we don't have to all be able to kind of design these kind of perfect kind of breathing, living houses or whatever. But we're brought into a different set of conversations that aren't simply mediated around surplus value, human capital, that kind of thing, where we can have direct conversations with each other about what this community needs in order to move its agendas forward. So I do think there's a need to work against the logic and the content of institutions as they have been defined within this kind of current mode.
Thank you.
Okay, so thank you to both of you for this initial dialogue. I would like to open the floor for all the questions that participants have. So if you do have a question, please use the feature in the Zoom app to raise your hand. Any questions? Okay,
Long term, you know.
I see two questions, one from Hans and one from Alpes. So in that order, if you could both pose your questions, and then Richard will and Christian will both answer to both of them.
Thank you very much, Richard, for your talk and for presenting the book. I was wondering, since you take a more like a pessimistic approach to the university, I was wondering which reasons do you actually see to still be at the university, or why would someone still go study today, or why should we continue our jobs here and not just completely go outside the university to do then something different? And what would that something different then be like? So I agree with the critical analysis, but to me then the question becomes, what can we do then? starting from this point of view? And what role can the university still have for us as academics? And how could we do academic work out of the institutional bounds of the university?
Thank you for that, Hans. Yeah, it's a tough question, isn't it? I suppose I am pessimistic, but which is why hope, uncritical hope, is not part of my thinking. But part of it is, I suppose, for me, I want to keep still living and breathing, and I love those around me, and I love working with my students, and I love my students. What's that all about? I love working with students, right, who just happen to be working with me. I love working with other researchers and being involved in this kind of in this kind of space. So I keep getting up even though in the morning, even though I'm kind of pessimistic. I think part of the issue is always, if you're not going to be in this space, you can be in this space and try to rupture this space. This space is in you and it's rupturing you all of the time. You know, it's rupturing us all of the time. So part of it for me, I suppose, is a sense that historically and materially, we built these spaces, right? People, when I look out the window and I see the brick-based buildings, there are men and women who laid those bricks and laid that mortar and built and have repurposed those laboratories and have put their intellectual work into those laboratories and their spaces, into teaching in that space. It's ours. It's ours, and it's been taken from us, is one thing. And I want to work through, well, what do we do about that then? Is there anything we can do about that? Well, the answer might be no. But what do we do about that then? How do we recapture that which was stolen from us? Knowledge, ways of knowing, skills, capacities, whatever it might be. So I guess that's part of it. Part of it, prosaically, is if you're not going to be in here, how are you going to put food on the table and pay down your debts and pay your rent or your mortgage? You know, we have to kind of work somewhere, I guess, and trying to do those things, you know, without money, for instance, inside, say, England, can become quite difficult. So part of it is that we keep on, not in the hope that this space will necessarily become any better, and we join unions and we do all of that, and we do casework and we do negotiating and we do whatever, and we do solidarity work around the water cooler in order to try to do something else. Because unless we can articulate very clearly something else beyond that enables us to kind of meet our needs. And within, certainly, say, if I think about this space here, there might be some people who can make their way by, I guess, tilling the land, working in communes, living in communes, doing, you know, engaging communally in issues around childcare and around kind of social welfare and around kind of healthcare and all of those things. Part of it for me is that I want to, I stay in this space because I'm institutionalized, but in part, I suppose, because I yearn to do something different with it, and because I don't feel like there's nothing I could do outside. I'm also that member of the family, right, who sits in the corner of the family party or the Christmas party or whatever, and who calls out, you know, who will be calling out the person who's making inappropriate statements about, you know, George Floyd or gender or whatever it might be, because that's the kind of person I am. I think in terms of kind of what the role is for us, I think we have to try to find spaces, places, ways of having those, of asking exactly that that point, either inside or outside. And I don't have a fix for this. Deliberately don't have a fix for this. Not intelligent enough to have a fix for this. I haven't been involved in enough social movement kind of work to necessarily understand where we go. But I think we have to have the kind of conversation about what this is doing to us. And that's one of the reasons why I'm very interested in elevating those stories and narratives, those concrete experiences from inside the institution, because we're told to focus on data and we're told to focus on numbers, and we're told to, you know, we can only do decolonial work or anti-racist work or gender equality work. Well, what are the numbers then? What are the numbers relating to that? Well, I'm interested in digging beyond that to look at the lived experiences. So how do we bring those how do we elevate those singular experiences in ways that don't enable the further brutalization of those bodies that have gone through those experiences. So that's incumbent then on people like me with power and prestige to elevate those narratives and stories. But that's part of the reason why I guess I sort of do the work that I do, in particular for the union. Part of it, though, I suppose, for me, is coming back to your point, is that I don't have, well, my reading of your questions is, you're right. It's a very deep contradiction. If you're going to write from within the space, well, why haven't you left the space? B, what are you going to do? If you're staying, what are you doing? That's why I try to take an activist position inside the space, mindful of the fact that it's exhausting. Mindful of that fact, and therefore self-care for me is like really important. You know, I'm going to shut up now.
Okay, so now I would like to ask Alpers to pose his question. Are you with us? Okay, so maybe he will come back to us, but in the meantime, we have also one question from the chat, so please allow me to read that one. Thanks for the introduction to the book. I'm wondering, how do you think your arguments resonate with other spaces outside of the UK? Also, if what you suggest is to sit down and work through hopelessness, isn't that also an activity only those who are privileged can do to an extent? Also, who is the collectivity you are calling upon?
Okay. Yeah. So I'm quite clear in that. Thank you ever so much, Zuza, for the questions. And you're right, and they're really and they rightfully call me out about a number of things. So I think in the book, I make it clear that I work in English higher education. I try to draw in examples, in particular from the North Atlantic, and I try to point to struggles that are happening, for instance, in say kind of South Sudan, and in India, that. About which I have a limited engagement, but I want to point to them. I want to talk about kind of, I suppose, ruptures and issues that are kind of being generalized and trying to relate them then, I suppose, to forms of kind of an ongoing kind of mode of kind of coloniality, an ongoing mode of restructuring, of making kind of pathological and methodological ways of kind of developing intellectual work. However, I hold my hands up and say that I am writing, and the bulk of my understanding comes from within English higher education, and it is being repurposed in very specific ways. So I hope that some of the themes might resonate, and you might be able to pick up with them in your own context. But I don't know enough about those contexts. However, I do think that English narrative needs to be brought into relation with those other struggles. So those, I don't know, around the time of the kind of the student occupations in 2009, 2010, we've got quite a lot of work going on with comrades in say in Quebec. So, you know, trying to learn from those sorts of struggles, but also very crucially, not simply trying to learn from those struggles inside the university, but trying to engage with the work of, for instance, Vanessa Andriotti and the kind of Gesturing Towards Decolonial Futures collective, the work of those individuals who are doing some very challenging work around issues like hospicing as things pass away and then move into new phases, about how they are trying to do work, I suppose, in my reading, about knowing the world otherwise, knowing the world differently. So I think part of it is, so when in your third question about the kind of collectivity that I'm calling upon, any collectivity that I might call upon would not simply include those inside the university. It would include those who are connected to the university as an associated capital, as a stakeholder, for want of a better term, inside that space, but also the families and loved ones and carers of those who are studying in that space or who live and work in that space, but also who are affected by the work of that space, or who are, to pick up on Hans's point, who are anti that space, who feel that they have had to leave that space because that space has left them. So, and that includes those who are doing work on decoloniality, those people who are doing work on forms of, say, in the United Kingdom, on an NHS reinstatement bill, for instance, so trying to tie healthcare in, and a nutrition on social goods more generally, as they are commodified and financialized and sold off and all of that. So how do we join up? So the collectivity I'm interested in gesturing towards would be at the level of society. But I have to say as well, I've written this book really not as a call to arms, because I deliberately do not do that work. I write because I quake inside, and I have to write this work, and it is therapeutic for me, and it is a way of me working through some of the traumas and tensions in me. So part of it is, and if I'm brutally honest, I don't expect in my lived experience that anybody will join me and help me. I expect that I will sort myself out, not from a selfish way, but just because of kind of a whole series of life experiences. And so I would never call upon, I would want to engage in a dialogue, I think. And I think that's quite important too. And it's one of the reasons why I always attempt to call out I fail a lot of the time, but I attempt to call out my own privilege and standing in that as well, and to try to listen to that of others. And I think that that's really important then in terms of your second question about the privilege of hopelessness, the privilege of being able to kind of think about hopelessness, an activity that only those who are privileged can do to an extent. And I think you're right. And I think that, you know, I was lucky and privileged enough to be able to go privately for a decade and have therapy for a decade. And and I know that's a privileged position, right? And I know from the pain and suffering of friends and of people, of other academics and professional services staff and students who cannot afford that, and there are huge waiting lists to get any kind of support for anxiety, depression, melancholia, whatever it is that they are struggling with through socially, that I know I'm in a kind of privileged position. I also know that the most important act of my life was being able to sit for years on end, mourning and grieving and weeping effectively, whilst also continuing. And I know that that is kind of privileged within the way in which we have constructed the world, which means that I have to be able to afford to pay for that. And that we can't do these things socially and collectively, because we've constructed the world in a fragmented, separated, disciplined, toxic, competitive way. So yeah, you're right. And one of the things that I want to be able to do, I suppose, is to work against that fragmentation in order that we can create different sets of relationships inside the university by calling the university out, and different sets of relationships inside society by calling society out and going on demos and contributing to occupations and giving my labor where I can, in order that I can create space so that others can do that work. I think, you know, otherwise the flip side is for me that we just sit with some the risk is that we focus upon uncritical hope, that we just hope I have to get up in the morning and hope it gets better, you know. And I think that's one of the risks. But thank you for those three really challenging questions, which I think I need to go and sit with a little more. But you've called me out on a number of points that I have also had to think about.
Okay, any more questions? I'm not sure, Alpes, whether you are back with us. I remember that you had a question. Okay. Okay, then maybe before someone else will raise their question, I have a small question. Richard, during your talk, you introduced this distinction, this tension between value, singular value, value for capital, and then you said that this value for capital, value as something singular, is in conflict with values plural. I wonder if you could simply elaborate on how you conceive the relations between value in plural and values value singular and values as plural in the context of university and higher education?
I suppose I kind of think about it in terms of the a starting point for me, I suppose, was reading those traumatic kind of pieces by well, when Sarah Ahmed is writing about her experiences at Goldsmiths, and when I suppose when Rosamund Gill is writing about neoliberal subjectivity inside the university, and when people are kind of talking about, I always remember there was a brilliant piece in Jacobin. Oh, my brain's gone dead. I'll talk about it while I look through the references, and we'll find out, and I'll remind myself about higher education as a kind of as a labor of love, that it was, and that was weaponized, that idea that higher education is a labor of love is kind of weaponized against us as when we work inside the university, because it means we will destroy ourselves. It means we will decompose ourselves. It means we will fragment ourselves in order to give ourselves to our work, be it kind of, you know, giving, and that might be in terms of kind of absolute surplus value. So we extend the length of the working day. It might mean that we, you know, I will invest in countless means of enriching my kind of human capital, because by upskilling myself, going on resilience courses, engaging with further kind of forms of technology. I think that part of that then is that what that enables us to do is to look at the values that that the university claims it holds around you know, kind of engagement with kind of communities, for instance, the values that it claims around dignity at work. And I think it enables us then to kind of look at, well, how are those framed then? Who are those framed for? What happened? Sarah Ahmed's brilliant on this, right? When she talks about complaint, for instance. So how are those kind of policies and frameworks used effectively to shut down particular voices and to shut down particular modes of inquiry about the university, in part, I suppose, to maintain a particular, you know, a particular engagement with value and brand awareness and all of that kind of thing. Which then, I suppose, brings me on to thinking more about, well, what are those direct, what are those kind of direct, kind of humane values that are acts of love? And it's important, I think, that kind of 6th chapter is about heart and soul. And I was very taken, certainly when I was in therapy, I was very taken by the work of Stephanie Dowrick, who's an Australian psychotherapist, moves to London. She writes this book called Forgiveness and Other Acts of Love, where she talks about issues in relation to things like courage and respect, for instance. So I was much more interested, I suppose, in those kind of those values of that might be related to liberty and equality and fraternity and that kind of thing, but a mutuality, but also connected, I think, directly through how do we demonstrate the courage to have kind of faith in ourselves and what we know is right or wrong, and courage to have faith in others to whom we think mirror us or have enable our voice, or who somehow we're kind of connected with, in order, I suppose, to push for justice. And I guess I get a sense that we aren't going to get peace without that kind of those modes of justice, but they are very specific kind of directly kind of mediated forms of kind of humane values. And I don't for a second negate the fact that actually you get people who are having to code switch in particular spaces, because if they present themselves as directly as huge as particular kinds of people, they'll be cast as willful or emotional, or aggressive, or whatever it might be. So for me, there's a very strong sense of the ways in which a kind of toxic culture that is predicated around the development of surplus, and you giving more of your surplus time, you giving more of your surplus energy, you giving more of yourself into the institution and its work, was then revealed as kind of, well, we'll talk about this in terms of the dignity at work policy and, mutual respect and tolerance and whatever. But actually how people are reporting on that in terms of pain, of anxiety, of having to leave, of not being heard, of not having their trauma witnessed, of actually their value as a human being being denigrated. And so that leads me on to kind of thinking a little bit more about this idea, I suppose, of our direct relationships, and the ways in which we kind of, the values that we hold dear within those that potentially, I guess, might be developed outside the institution in more authentic ways. So there's something about an authenticity as well. And I'll be quiet there whilst I keep reading my references, because it's bothering me now that I can't remember who that was.
All right. While Richard is looking through his references, there is a time for maybe one more question. Okay, there is actually question in the chat, so let me read it. Thank you. Just some thoughts. How do we as an academic community break down some of those barriers, as we of course have very limited power or control? Basically asking, where can we see the hope?
All right, I'll come to that one in a second. It's Mia Tokumitsu. Okay. Mia Tokumitsu. It's called "In the Name of Love," from Jacobin, and it's a beautifully written piece. Raj is. Thank you for your question, Raj. You're trolling me by mentioning hope. How do we break down some of these barriers? And we do have limited power or control, and we do as individuals have limited power and control. And therefore, I think it is incumbent upon us to do this work collectively. And we are restructured and repurposed all of the time as competing individuals. And so I think it is incumbent upon us to share stories and share narratives, and to listen and to hear, and to do so authentically, and with care and love in our hearts. And to do that in a way that respects the kind of individuals with whom we work as whole individuals, as carers, as people who are grieving, as people who have suffered during the pandemic, as people who have caring responsibilities, who are doing other forms of social work as well. And that we do that in ways that are caring of those many-sided kind of elements, and that we do that work where I'm always very taken, right? I'm very taken by things. Dare Jamil, who writes about environmentalism, was asked, he's kind of, did work on the Iraq war and now does work on kind of environmental rupture. He was asked really effectively about where does one could place one's energy in a million places, where do you do it? And he argues we don't all have to be storytellers, and we don't all have to be therapists, and we don't all have to be teachers, and we don't all have to be activists, and we don't all have to chain ourselves to an Excel Keystone pipeline, and we don't all have to chain ourselves to BP trucks or whatever. We don't all have to face down armed guards, but we do have to do something, and we have to do that thing that is in our heart and soul collectively, and we have to be in conversation with others in the ways in which we do it. And I suppose inside the university, I think about that in terms of my own role, working with a range of others, professional services students, precarious, Black, queer, a whole range of individuals about whom I have limited understanding, but about whom I care about their ability to live and exist in the world. So part of it for me is how do we do that respects ourselves and others without giving all of ourselves away? And that's part of the problem. The system wants us to give all of ourselves away, and that's terrible. So part of it for me then is how do we do that inside the institution in relation to trade unions as well, our engagement across trade unions with professional services and student union bodies too. How do we do that work then bleeding into society? So what are the conversations that we have there? And that may mean that for some of us, some of the time we put our bodies on the line and our minds on the line in very different ways. And it is the act of acting, it is in the return of history, because we're now at the end of history. It is in the return of history and our ability to see that we can have some form of agency that is where I see hope, if there is any hope.
All right, so I would like to thank you for today's meeting, today's seminar. It's run its course, and before the end, I would like just to make a quick announcement. We were taking a holiday hiatus for at least 3 months, but we will be back in September with some information about new meetings and new seminars. So watch out for that. And if you would like, you can also subscribe to our mailing list, so you won't be omitted when we will finally come up with the plan for the next academic year. Thank you once again very much, Richard. It was a great pleasure to have you with us. I hope that this is not the last conversation that we are having, and you will join us next academic year with your new project. Our floor is open to you and your contributions. So I hope we will have you back with us soon. And also big thanks to all the participants. Look forward to meeting you again in September, October. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you. Peace be with you. Thank you.
Thank you.